Okay, so the Parliamentary Party Betting and Gaming Group is a group of members of parliaments who are interested in gambling. I have a particular interest in gambling politics from a UK perspective. I've spoken at a number of conferences on this topic over the last 3 decades, and I have even written a PhD on British gambling politics. So that's who I am. I'm here today to talk about the future of British gambling regulation. As you know, we've had a rather fraught few years in the UK. This started with the campaign against the fixed odds betting terminals. Fixed odds betting terminals, for those of you who don't know, were high stakes gaming machines. They were electronic roulette located in betting shops. And there was a vociferous campaign against them, and it was very effective, basically because the gambling industry was utterly rubbish at campaigning back. What they did was just say, if you touch fixed odds betting terminals, it will affect jobs and taxes. And because the opposition were fighting on this is killing people, this is, just a piece of evil, and the gambling industry is rapacious capitalists, they won. And basically the outcome of that campaign, which has now been launched against online gambling, is we have a press, a public, and a parliament who hate gambling in the UK. And it's one of those things with politics, is you're either in or you're out. And we went from being in to out. And what this means is very little we do as an industry makes any difference. What I would be saying is, this is a very bad time to be in the British gambling industry, because we have stakeholders who are actively trying to do us down. So what is the future? Well, I have a very straightforward what is the future speech. And then the coronavirus came along. And I think that has changed everybody. Hang on one second. Aren't they great? So, going back to what I was saying, the political environment in the UK is absolutely anti-gambling. I speak to CEOs the whole time, and they're all pulling their hair out. Because what we have is a legacy of bad behavior. So a number of our companies a few years ago were really very poor in the way they looked out for problem gamblers and money launderers. And the Gambling Commission has investigated them, and the outcome of those investigations is coming out now. So every week we have one after another gambling company being fined millions of pounds for not doing enough on problem gambling and not doing enough on anti-money laundering. And I have to say that some of it is warranted, some of it is slightly excessive. If you actually count the number of people involved, if you count the number of problem gamblers involved, we are talking probably 10 or 12 each. You know, if you work out the total fines per problem gambler, it's probably, you know, over £1 million per problem gambler. Why? Because we have a regulator who is actively trying to attack the gambling industry. And I say that without any restriction. Since their previous CEO, Sarah Harrison, our regulator has turned into a political animal and knows that the more it does in the press beating up the gambling industry, the better it looks for them. And that just goes to fuel the fire. The Gambling Commission constantly coming out with fines, constantly coming out with comments about how the gambling industry has to do a lot better. And that is picked up by the press. We have evidence that our regulator has been manipulating the press to ensure that it used a report on children gambling, which didn't show there were children gambling, to make the press believe there were children gambling. So we have a regulator who is actively acting against the interests of the industry it is legally there to support. Now, from a parliamentary perspective, they really couldn't give a crap about gambling until it's a problem. And when the regulator is setting the tone that we are an industry out of control, well, the press go crazy. So as I was saying before, I, for a second, thought I was just shouting into an empty room, which just literally I am. Everything now with coronavirus has changed. So on the one hand, no one gives a crap. But, and on the other hand, this could be the real killing off of the British gambling industry, because the anti-gambling campaigners are saying that forced isolation is causing people to gamble. And there is some evidence that there is more gambling online. Now, what we don't know is whether or not the complete close down of the land-based gambling industry has just been shifted to online, or whether actually there is more and more gambling online, which I wouldn't be surprised, because people are spending more time at home and are bored. And gambling is fun and exciting, and why wouldn't you sit at home and have a little bit of a gamble? But because of the political environment we are in the UK at the moment, anything which suggests people should gamble is considered a negative. Let me give you an example. last weekend we had the virtual Grand National. Grand National is a horse race over jumps, world famous, which is why I'm having to tell you about it. It happens every year, and the whole British public takes an interest. You know, it's one of those times when people bet on horse races when they don't bet for the rest of the year. Now, obviously, with the virus, they couldn't hold it. So what did they do? They did a virtual one, cartoon racing, and I have to say, sorry, there is a group of MPs who wrote a letter, went to the press, and argued it was shocking that this was going on. Now, let me point out that if you wanted to bet on the Grand National, you were limited to £10 per horse, and all the profits were going to the National Health Service. Yet we still had a bunch of politicians who felt capable that they could make a big thing about it. Now, what we've seen elsewhere around Europe is people starting to bring in, okay, maximum losses, closing down of online gambling, real over-the-top reactions. What my worry is if we start going down that line, and it wouldn't take much. It really wouldn't take much. If we go down, or any country goes down that line, it's then very difficult to go back. So, in essence, the future of UK regulation is much stricter regulation. So what we're going to see is an increase on this concept called affordability, where gambling companies will be expected to find out how much their customers earn and work out how much they then have to spend, what their disposable income is, and make a judgment about what is an acceptable amount for gambling. It's ludicrous. You know, I can sit here and order 400 bottles of vodka. No one gives a crap. But we will soon be in a place where if I have over 50 quid betting in a week, people will be intervening and everything like that. So that will kill off the industry. It's not what it will do. Where we're going to end up is a UK industry which is probably a third of the size it is now. And I mean by number of operators. So if you take it, we have the total gambling market. Currently, there are about 550 licensed operators, and they are splitting that up between them. Now, the increased regulatory cost will mean we will probably lose 300 of those operators. Now, what that will mean is that the size of the industry will just divide up between those remaining 200 far bigger operators. And that, I think, is what the regulator wants. Less operators means less active regulation. And all evidence is that our regulator is happy doing big pieces of investigation work, which gives it good PR. But the day-to-day dealing with lots of small operators, it's not that bothered about. So I think it's happy with a lot less operators, and obviously smaller numbers of bigger operators is better, because from a regulator's perspective, bigger companies regulate better because they have bigger compliance teams. Also, what will happen is we're going to have a far bigger black market targeting the UK, because customers are going to go, someone in government has decided that based on my income or their assumption of my income, I should only do this much gambling. Well, being a free-spirited person, no, I'm going to go to the black market, because the black market is just a few clicks away. And what we will see is increase, for the regulated market, more regulation, which means more cost and higher taxes. So the cost of doing business in the UK is going to go up. Why wouldn't you just have a Maltese license and target the UK? You would pay less tax. Now, it depends on what Malta is like on a regulatory perspective. But if they're too strict, you'd move somewhere else. I mean, what governments don't realise, and that is because we've given up on evidence-based policy making, looking at the science, which hopefully they're going to be doing with the coronavirus, but they've given up doing with gambling. Now it's just, which newspaper, which moral campaign do we agree with? What they don't realise is actually tougher and tougher restrictions do not mean less and less problem gamblers. What it means is problem gamblers go into the black market. And by increasing costs and making it too difficult to operate in the UK, you increase the size of the black market. So the government, right, I'm taking it, I'm back. So what I'm saying is governments are going to shoot themselves in their foot. Governments are going to shoot themselves in their foot by being overly restrictive. But they don't care, because governments last only a few years. And when you impose tough restrictions, the impact of that takes a few years to work through the system. So we've already seen, an end to credit cards. We're going to have affordability. That will be the killer. I think we'll have increased regulation on looking at basically where I think we will end up is there will be a limit to what you can lose per month, and it will be purely arbitrary. So it will be, say, £500. If you want to spend or lose more than £500 a month, you will have to go and prove to your gambling operator all about your sanity, your wealth, your source of wealth, probably the size of your feet and what you like to eat on a Tuesday, whatever they can throw into it. Because they have a belief now that, and this is what they've done, is for the last 10, 15 years, we had an approach to problem gambling, which was basically saying problem gamblers are born, and the best we can do is try and identify them and try and give them help. It's called responsible gambling approach. Due to purely politics, we now have what is called the national health approach, which is an idea that you need to reduce the amount of gambling. You use national health approaches currently in the UK to reduce the amount of alcohol being drunk, to reduce the amount of illegal drugs being taken, and to reduce the amount of knife crime. That is the category they're putting gambling in now. And the idea is the more you can do to make gambling restricted, the more you will reduce the number of problem gamblers. There is absolutely no evidence that this is the case. And I believe this will blow up in their faces, because all the problem gamblers will go into the black market where there is no obligation to give them any help. Why would, if you're a problem gambler and you need your hit, why are you going to mess around doing all this? You want to see my photograph of my passport next to my head with the newspaper showing the day, and here's 6 years worth of bank statements, and here in, talk to my accountant, and by the way, please take this written affidavit from my wife that, bullshit. Problem gambler is just going to go, oh, look, here's a gambling site based in God knows where. They will take my money and pay it out again. That's all I care about. So that will mean the number of problem gamblers will go up. And the regulated gambling industry will suffer because it will be seen as their fault. So where do we end up? Where's the end game? I really do think, first off, 80% chance gambling turns into the new tobacco, i.e. no advertising, real massive restraints on marketing, and it's basically just almost impossible to do business in this country. What do I think there's a 20% chance of? They nationalize gambling. There is one gambling organization run by the state, and that's it. So that's my good news. I'm taking it now. That's all I have to say. Do I take it now? I take questions. The banking opportunities versus regulation. So I think they will restrict banking opportunities more and more. So I think the days of being able to come up with 100 different ways of getting money to an operator are over. I think we can basically show, I think we'll, excuse me, I think we will end up in a place where the only way you would fund your gambling account in the UK is out of your bank account. And that is a bank account which has brought in a method to self-exclude. I mean, the obvious thing about self-exclusion, and for those of you who don't know, self-exclusion is where a player contacts the operator and says, I want to be self-excluded, and then they are banned from the website, usually for a period of a minimum of 6 months, and that can be extended up to 7 years. And we now have a national system called GamStop. So that means if you self-exclude with GamStop, you self-exclude with everybody in the UK. Now, that seems like a good idea, and boy, has it taken. So we're in 2020, and this first idea was to get a national one was 10 years ago. It's taken us 10 years to get that system in, and it doesn't work that well. The obvious thing is to use banking. Stop people at their bank account level from funding gambling if they feel they have a problem. So it's the banks, and this is the thing, is that that system only works if the only way you can fund your gambling is through your bank. If you've got loads of other payment methods, then you get round it. And I think what they will do is restrict those payment methods. Jeremy Phillips, how are you, sir? As I would expect, a fabulous question. To what extent do you think the UK GC could improve its position by offering operators clearer and more explicit guidance on regulatory settlements and restitution? I happen to know that part of the reason all the fines we're seeing now, the offence took place a number of years ago because basically the Gambling Commission has come in, says you've broken the rules, we're going to fine you, and then the deal is, then they start doing a deal. And so what happens is the company's lawyers go up against the Gambling Commission and they argue about what the fine will be. And what is ended up with, I'm not saying is an arbitrary amount, but what we have at the moment is two regulators of gambling, as in we have the Gambling Commission and the ASA, which is now the teeth of the ASA is with the Gambling Commission. But both those regulators, if you spend time looking through what they have done, how much they have fined, what they have, what they have called out, it almost looks arbitrary. The ASA has taken down adverts when one person has complained. The ASA has taken down adverts with the most broadest interpretation of the regulations. The UK Gambling Commission, I think, has imposed, for the number of people involved, really quite extortionate funds. Because I go back and I say, ignore, you know, we all focus on the amount of money. When you read about these enforcement actions, look at the number of people involved. So this is purely how you manipulate the press. If you go to the press with a headline that the gambling industry was fined, you know, 20 odd million pounds last year, the press go, well, they're all basically terrorists. If you go to the press and say, we actually only found less than 10 examples of where the rules were breached, compared to the millions of people gambling, it looks like the industry isn't doing too badly. And I would have to say, I'm got friends in the industry. I've got one friend who's going through a license review at the moment. And the problem is what they're saying is, yes, if you take a very broad view of what we did, you could say, yes, we weren't good enough. But actually, if you look at it with that kind of good faith, what they were doing, they thought was good enough. It was just the Gambling Commission have come in and said, well, you haven't gone to the 20th degree. Now, because the Gambling Commission has spent so long saying, we want you to do far more, but we're not going to tell you what, no one in the industry knows what level they're supposed to be working at. So, yes, Jeremy, the UKGC really does need to be fair and open and basically stop beating up the industry, which it is legally required to support. Anyone else with a question? Right, I think I may have done my time. Unless, yes, no, right, I'm off. Thank